The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Refugees and migrants attempting to create a new life in Europe are prompting considerable soul-searching within the EU. Their sheer number and the frequently tragic end of their journeys off the Mediterranean coast have raised questions about immigration law, borders, mobility, and human rights. At a deeper level, many citizens are pondering what it means to be European in the 21st century. For some, thoughts on a continent seemingly poised between ideals of liberal democracy and a darker history of nationalist reaction were joined by Jeffrey Sommers, Associate Professor of Political Economy and Public Policy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he also serves as a Senior Fellow at the Institute of World Affairs. In addition, he holds associate faculty and research positions with the Institute for Research on Migration, Ethnicity, and Society at Linköping University in Sweden, the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, and the Center for European and Transition Studies at the University of Latvia. Jeff Sommers, welcome back.
Great to be here, Doug.
Well, let's start out with just a look at what's driving this movement of people from elsewhere to the shores of Europe.
Well, we have a kind of axis, I guess, where we have, let's say, a horizontal axis of a civil war in Syria, which is driving this emigration. So the civil war is a consequence of ethnic and religious divides that exist within Syria. Those have been aggravated by several factors, one being pipeline politics and cash, which is coming into the country to pursue and try and deliver certain agendas. Chiefly Qatar and Saudi Arabia would like to see Syria go into Sunni hands and to use it as a major pipeline route for gas into the European Union. In contrast to that, we have Russia and its Syrian partner of Bashar al-Assad, representing the Alawite community, Shia community, which sees their interests, along with Iran, as being better served by exporting oil and gas out of that region and from Iran into Europe. So we have these very, very kind of realpolitik issues that are playing out. And then in a kind of vertical axis, we have these wars of choice which have occurred. So, we see a Russia which wants to defend the interests of Assad and its national interests. We have a United States and some European partners which would like to reduce the power of the Shia, which, again, not only include the Assad regime, but also Iran, and to also diminish Russian power. And so they have worked to fuel and arm the opposition to what has been granted a very, very cruel at times regime. And then, of course, we have all of these wars of choice which have occurred in North Africa and in the Middle East. So we have significant emigration occurring from Libya, where the United States and France chiefly, but also Britain to a lesser extent, thought that they could remove Colonel Muammar Gaddafi without any costs ensuing or being consequent from this action. We've seen that, unfortunately, it's been quite messy. And then, of course, there was the war in Iraq, the second war in Iraq. The first one, of course, under George Bush, number 41, left an Iraq that was not in perfect shape, but one that was relatively stable. It had Saddam Hussein, of course, in power, and it was George Bush's son, the 43rd president of the United States, and the neocons, as we colloquially refer to them, which decided that it would solve a lot of problems to take Saddam Hussein out of Iraq, but this has led to a destabilization of the region, lots of refugees coming out of Iraq, and out of the outcome of the Iraqi military. We've seen the emergence of ISIS and the further destabilization of both Iraq and Syria. So we have all these factors at work that are driving conflict.
And let's talk a little bit about scale. I mean, how do the numbers of people moving now compare to a decade ago?
Well, by many, 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 many multiples, of course. I mean, again, when you had a stable Libya, when you had a stable Iraq, when you had a stable Syria, there was very little of this kind of immigration. There was certainly some, but not much. And it was chiefly, of course, economic rather than political. So what we've seen, of course, though, is that since 2011 in Syria, we've had the regime of Bashar al-Assad engaged in the civil war, which resulted in a full 250,000 of its people being killed. Nearly half of the country's people now being homeless. Now, most of these refugees are still located within the Levant or the Middle East. I mean, they're in countries like Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon. So some 90% of them are still within the region. But roughly 10% have fled to Europe. And of course, that's going to accelerate greatly in the ensuing months.
So, and you touch on a key point here. The designation of someone as a refugee, as an asylum seeker versus a migrant is very political. Under current EU rules, asylum seekers first of all have to be fleeing persecution and face imminent harm or death at home. But once the determination has been made that they are, in fact are legitimate asylum seekers, it triggers requirements on the part of the receiving country, including just feeding, offering any first aid or medical care, sheltering, and significantly giving them the right to work within 9 months. So is that something that the current system can handle given the increase in numbers?
Well, we'll certainly see. It certainly is going to stress the ability of the European Union to handle this many migrants. In principle, if the situation did not further deteriorate, and if we didn't see a significant portion of these 90% of refugees which are currently residing, again, in places like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, if they attempt to, say, all leave, then it could be a much bigger challenge. So we also, of course, know that much of the European Union has had some difficulties in finding employment for its young people. Many of these refugees or asylum seekers are young, so we'll see how that turns out. So it could be quite difficult. So these are goals and principles which are quite important, and hopefully the European Union will be able to maintain them. But of course, their ability to do so will be entirely dependent upon the number of people who try to leave. Now, of course, we should also say that since the United States had some role in these conflicts, that perhaps it could be doing more to take more people. Now, of course, this isn't a decision that can be rendered by any one person, but it's rather unfortunate that we have seen among some quarters a complete resistance to taking any. Again, we had Governor Huckabee from Arkansas, former Governor Huckabee from Arkansas, who made the kind of flip remark that these people were merely those who were trying to secure access to cable TV and a much more comfortable life for themselves. But I think we know that the situation is far more serious than that, and we need to begin looking at what we in this country can also do to take some, not to overstress our infrastructure either, or even social stability, which is something that is quite important. But we need to figure out how we can place these people.
Well, in the case of Europe, the mobility within Europe has been sort of a hallmark of the modern EU. And in fact, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker recently said it was a unique symbol of European integration. The idea that there's basically a perimeter around Europe, but once you're inside, you're inside. And so how is that changing?
Yeah, well, the Schengen zone, of course, does allow for this near total mobility within much of the European Union. And of course, I've enjoyed that over the past 15 years or so. I am certainly old enough to recall when it didn't exist, and of course the rather cumbersome procedures that one had to engage in terms of border crossings, many of them, of course, in a continent which has so many countries. This was not only somewhat inconvenient for the researcher or the tourist, but it really impeded commerce. So for truckers and for people who are actually trying to ship goods, it proved to be a significant impediment to efficiency of trade. So we already see that this is beginning to break down with the razor wire that Hungary has begun to put up on its border, the criminalization of those who are seeking to use its country for transit purposes. We see some rather serious moves to control these movements in Slovakia as well, also in Serbia. Austria is beginning to put in place some controls. So we are beginning to see the unraveling of the Schengen zone and pressures on it, which in some regards have their analog with the monetary union, the Eurozone. In other words, you're trying to take all these countries, many of which are at very different levels of economic development, different histories, and throw them into one monetary union. And we saw the problems that ensued from that following the 2008 economic crisis. Now, it was only with a lot of bailing wire that system was able to remain intact and not come apart. We'll see if the Schengen zone can similarly survive the stresses under which it is going to be placed. But just to further augment that point, again, if you have refugees that are coming into poor countries, so in other words, the European Union, Brussels has said that it is going to try and come up with some quota system. It's going to allocate a certain number of refugees to certain countries in an attempt to achieve some balance, not to overstress any one particular country. But this I think is quite a fiction in terms of being able to successfully and orderly do this. If you have, say, somebody who's being placed in Estonia or in Bulgaria, they're not going to be interested in staying in these places, even though those places do have their charms and virtues. They're going to want to go to a Germany or a Sweden. And with the Schengen zone, they'll be able to do precisely just that. So if this refugee crisis worsens, actually that's not an if, we already know that it will, but depending upon the order of magnitude in terms of which it gets worse, it could really erode and even lead to the discarding of the Schengen zone potentially.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the fissures that are really being exposed and exacerbated by the stress that this movement of people is really creating. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with Jeffrey Sommers about migration in Europe. Well, before the break, we were talking a little bit about sort of the scale and drivers of the situation. Let's talk a little bit about impacts. Now, there are some sort of pre-existing fissures within Europe that this is only bringing more to the forefront. The one we hear about often is just sort of north-south, the wealthy north versus the poor south. How is this situation impacting that?
Well, of course. I mean, it's the poor South, which is having to absorb initially most of these migrants by location. So their location in this instance is not good from their perspective in terms of having to absorb all of these emigres. So it's very difficult for them. But of course, many of them are hoping to move on. So in other words, the problem is not a long-term one in terms of actually all of those people who wish to continue residence in those countries. They hope to move north.
Well, in fact, there's a policy issue there as well. There's an agreement that says the country of that first hosts these people has the responsibility to sort of sort out their status.
Exactly.
Whereas if you're Greece, if you're Italy, there's a vested interest in just sort of getting them
Move
over your
along.
border as quickly as possible, isn't it?
Right, exactly. So, I mean, we're going to see those cleavages, of course, emerge. And then, of course, there's another divide, and that's the East-West divide in Europe as well, which is an extremely important one. And we have to remember that East Europe is, on the whole, much poorer than West Europe, even poorer than Southern Europe. And so these countries are really not in a position, both economically, but also kind of culturally and historically, psychologically, perhaps even more importantly, to absorb any significant numbers of refugees. I mean, so for instance, just to take the case of the Baltic states, where I do a good bit of work, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, they have been trying to figure out, well, how would they provide housing, for these communities of refugees? And it's not so easy. So in a place like Sweden, which of course, pointing out first the obvious difference of a country that's just much richer, but it has a lot of municipal housing. So the state has, these levers that it can work to actually place people in housing. Whereas in the Baltic states, in their zeal to become, in their minds, in 1991 or 1992, westernized, they privatized everything. So all of the housing stock, nearly all of it, is all owned by individuals. So for them, it would be a matter of actually having to construct housing, which again for them would be very expensive and not something that's very readily or easily done. And I guess I would also say that, at the risk of perhaps being somewhat controversial, much of the Warsaw Pact nations, many of them never went through the kind of intellectual or psychological decolonization that took place after World War II that you saw in West Europe. So the levels of intolerance are perhaps a bit higher, reflecting pre-World War II of Europe and their conceptions of culture, identity, ethnicity, etc. So it gets quite sticky quite quickly.
Well, and that brings up a point. I mean, there are migrants and there are migrants. I mean, there is a danger, isn't there, that there could be sort of a beauty contest for who we may want to let in and who we may not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how this issue is handled, of course, is going to be very important for how the situation unfolds going forward. So on one level, many in the European Union wish to maintain these core principles of offering asylum to these refugees and can potentially do so, again, if the numbers don't become too great. In other words, if the majority of that 90% of that refugee population that is currently in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, as long as the majority of them don't try to go to Europe immediately, then they might be able to maintain that. But if they do, then it's going to get more difficult. So you also, of course, have the possibility, and I don't want to fuel again this, I think, somewhat, as I remarked with former Governor Huckabee, this tendency to just disregard these migrants as being economic migrants. But if you open your doors too fully, well, then you will start to get economic migrants, and that could overstress the ability of the European Union to actually process these more, as you were saying, we're parsing people out here, legitimate migrants, asylum seekers. So it's tricky and it's difficult. If I could add one more point, though, and that is to say that on one level, much of this migration that we're seeing globally is a consequence, really, I think, of the dissolution of the developmental state of the 20th century. And so in the 20th century, we had this idea that states would be created that would create national economies, regional economies, and a political class of leaders were really invested intellectually and psychologically in this goal. And even though the various countries around the world may not have always succeeded in their attempts to actually create successful economic development, the goal was very often there, the attempt was made, and there were successes. I think as a consequence of kind of tearing apart that order, we're seeing this far less stable kind of architecture, global architecture, which is leading to this increased migration. So in other words, we need to do something to reduce the number of wars of choice, even though sometimes the alternatives look quite messy. So not intervening can sometimes lead to some humanitarian catastrophes as well. But we seem to have too readily selected that option, with some rather unpleasant consequences ensuing. And we also, unfortunately, in our attempts to deal with leaders who we thought were not compliant, eliminated them and or their systems, which represented these kinds of developmental states, and instead have just kind of created an environment in which chaos seems to increasingly be reigning.
So we've talked a lot about sort of the negatives. Is there a plus for demographically for some of the nations within the EU for this influx of mostly younger people?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for a country like Germany, which has a natural rate of reproduction or of births per female of 1.4 persons, and many other European Union states having similar low birth rates. This could actually help them out demographically. So this is something, and that's why I say, that this can be handled to a certain extent. The European Union actually does need more people, and if they're not going to produce them themselves, then they need to come from somewhere else. There are a few exceptions to this case. France does a pretty good job with regards to reproducing its own countrymen. Ireland, Sweden is doing a little bit better. But many countries in the European Union are not doing this, and so they're going to need to import people if they're going to maintain their social benefits and robust economies.
So there's the demographic logic to that, and there's the economic benefit, which you could predict would flow from that. But there's a cultural side of it that I think people are often a lot less comfortable with. And we've seen some of that pushback, the rise of sort of nationalist right-wing parties, for the most part right-wing now. Look at the Labour Party in the UK has just changed leadership to a much more Eurosceptic kind of thing. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and this kind of very much reminds me of this movement within Russia, which is just called against the center. So you often have, of course, the left and the right unifying in their opposition to the center. So this is, on one level, somewhat disturbing, especially if we take a long view of Europe's history. So we often present Europe as this kind of idealized society of civilized nations that are very orderly. They're very rational, very peaceful. But of course, we know that before the 1940s, extending back to the Holy Roman Empire, it was a place which saw no small amount of conflict and quite brutal conflict. So I think we do need to be careful about destabilizing societies. I don't want to take the conservative argument too far, because their response often will be that we almost need autarky. We need to defend the race and all that kind of stuff, which we have seen where that leads. But I think we do need to be sensitive to cultural differences and the capacity of societies to absorb new people. So even in France, which has a relatively high number of people from North Africa and who are typically Muslims, France has not done the best job of assimilating those populations. They often live in these high rises in the suburbs, and they exist as a kind of separate population outside of the mainstream of French life that is often very dissatisfied. There's the same thing in Sweden. Even though so many of these migrants are desperate to get to Sweden, they'll often say that's where they want to go. The southern part of Sweden, which is currently holding so many Iraqi refugees, is a place which is getting increasingly messy in terms of tensions between the local Swedes and the refugee populations. And people are really beginning to question just how much of this migration they could take. So it's very clear that this all has to be handled with the greatest sensitivity, lest we create a rather extremist backlash, which I think most people would not like to see.
Well, we've got just about a minute left. We'll say you get back to your office and Brussels is calling and saying, help us, please, Dr. Sommers, how shall we manage this? What is your back-of-the-envelope advice?
Well, I would suggest that they actually reconsider the very design of the European Union and to rethink everything from the euro to these unified policies which they've applied across all of Europe. And they need to think of Europe in terms of zones. So at some point, perhaps, they can be homogenized in terms of their levels of development, et cetera. But until they reach that time, this idea of creating an ideal kind of Europe is a bit premature and a bit too utopian and may lead to many problems.
Very good. Well, as always, great pleasure speaking with you.
Great to be here again, Doug. Thanks.
And to our viewers, we'll see you soon with more International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,